Welcome to Lesson 7 of To Kill a Mockingbird, in which we go through Chapter 9. These video lessons are made for the Grade 10 pupils of St. Patrick's CBC in Kimberley, South Africa. As an English department, we are making our materials freely available to anybody who can use them. This is our contribution to education in South Africa during this difficult lockdown period. I am using the Heinemann edition of the novel, and today's work starts from page 80. As we work through this rather long chapter, I'd like you to focus on these 4 issues. Firstly, the theme of racism, which is introduced here. Secondly, Scout's battles with growing up and maturing. Thirdly, gender issues, particularly the role of femininity. And fourthly, the way Atticus's parenting style is explored. For this chapter, my students have received this worksheet. It's printed at the end of your lesson plans. As we work through the chapter, fill in where you can, and at the end of the chapter, complete the page properly. Chapter 9 introduces a somewhat darker theme or note to the novel. And in this novel, not for the first time, we get the N-word. I'd like to take a moment just to pause here to explain why I won't be reading the N-word in these recordings. It's a personal decision, and I choose not to read it aloud as I would hate to cause offense to anybody. Remember that the novel is set in the 1930s. It was written during the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement, and it is an incredibly loaded and emotive word. It adds value, I think, to the text, but it is very sensitive. So wherever the N-word is used, I shall substitute it or gloss over it. Chapter 9, on page 80. Scout is embroiled in a playground fight. "You can just take that back, boy." This order given by me to Cecil Jacobs was the beginning of a rather thin time for Jem and me. My fists were clenched and I was ready to let fly. Atticus had promised me he would wear me out if he ever heard of me fighting any more. I was far too old and too big for such childish things, and the sooner I learned to hold in, the better off everybody would be. I soon forgot. Cecil Jacobs made me forget. He had announced in the schoolyard the day before that Scout Finch's daddy defended black men. I denied it, but told Jem. What did he mean saying that? Nothing. Ask Atticus, he'll tell you. Do you defend black men, Atticus? Of course I do. And don't say the N-word, Scout, that's common. But it's what everybody at school says. Well, from now on, it will be everybody less one. Skip a paragraph. Do all lawyers defend black people, Atticus? Of course they do, Scout. Well, then why did Cecil say you defended black men? He made it sound like you were running a still. I'm simply defending a black man. His name is Tom Robinson. He lives in that little settlement beyond the town dump. He's a member of Calpurnia's church, and Cull knows his family well. She says they are clean-living folks. Scout, you aren't old enough to understand some things yet, but there's been some high talk around town to the effect that I shouldn't do much about defending this man. It's a peculiar case. It won't come to trial until summer session. John Taylor was kind enough to give us a postponement. Well, if you shouldn't be defending him, then why are you doing it? Well, for a number of reasons. The main one is, if I didn't, I couldn't hold up my head in town. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature. I couldn't even tell you or Jem not to do something again. You mean if you didn't defend that man, Jem and me wouldn't have to mind you anymore? Well, that's about right. Why? Because I could never ask you to mind me again, Scout. Simply by the nature of the work, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. And this one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me if you will. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down, no matter what anybody says to you. Don't you let them get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. Atticus, are we going to win it? No, honey. Then why? Well, simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win, Atticus said. And that's a key quote in the novel, everyone. I would highlight it if I were you. Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win. Of course, licked there means beaten. Skip 13 lines. Come here, Scout. I crawled into his lap and tucked my head under his chin. He put his arms around me and rocked me gently. It's different this time. This time we aren't fighting the Yankees, we're fighting our friends. But remember this, no matter how bitter things get, they are still our friends, and this is still our home. With this in mind, I faced Cecil Jacobs in the schoolyard next day. You gonna take that back, boy? You gotta make me first. My folks said your daddy was a disgrace, and that black man ought to hang from the water tank. I drew a bead on him. I aimed for him with my fist, remembered what Atticus had said, and then dropped my fists and walked away. Scout's a coward ringing in my ears. It was the first time I ever walked away from a fight. Somehow, if I fought Cecil, I would let Atticus down. Atticus so rarely asked Jem and me to do something for him, I could take being called a coward for him. I felt extremely noble for having remembered, and remained noble for 3 weeks. And then Christmas came, and disaster struck. Jem and I viewed Christmas with mixed feelings. The good side was the tree and Uncle Jack Finch. Every Christmas Eve day, we met Uncle Jack at Maycomb Junction, and he would spend a week with us. A flip of the coin revealed the uncompromising lineaments of Aunt Alexandra and Francis. You will remember the family tree. Atticus has a brother, Jack, and a sister, Alexandra. I suppose I should include Uncle Jimmy, Aunt Alexandra's husband, but as he never spoke a word to me in my life except to say, "Get off the fence," once, I never saw any reason to take notice of him. Neither did Aunt Alexandra. Long ago, in a burst of friendliness, Auntie and Uncle Jimmy produced a son named Henry, who left home as soon as was humanly possible, married, and produced Francis. Henry and his wife deposited Francis at his grandparents' every Christmas, and then pursued their own pleasures. No amount of sighing could induce Atticus to let us spend Christmas Day at home. We went to Finch's Landing every Christmas in my memory. The fact that Auntie was a good cook was some compensation for being forced to spend a religious holiday with Francis Hancock. He was a year older than I, and I avoided him on principle. He enjoyed everything I disapproved of, and disliked my ingenuous diversions. Aunt Alexandra was Atticus's sister, but when Jem told me about changelings and siblings, I decided that she had been swapped at birth, that my grandparents had perhaps received a Crawford instead of a Finch. Had I ever harbored the mystical notions about mountains that seem to obsess lawyers and judges, Aunt Alexandra would have been analogous to Mount Everest. Throughout my early life, she was cold and there. When Uncle Jack jumped down from the train Christmas Eve day, we had to wait for the porter to hand him 2 long packages. Jem and I always thought it funny when Uncle Jack pecked Atticus on the cheek. They were the only 2 men we ever saw kiss each other. Uncle Jack shook hands with Jem and swung me high, but not high enough. Uncle Jack was a head shorter than Atticus. The baby of the family, he was younger than Aunt Alexandra. He and Auntie looked alike, but Uncle Jack made better use of his face. We were never wary of his sharp nose and chin. He was one of the few men of science who never terrified me, probably because he never behaved like a doctor. Whenever he performed a minor service for Jem and me, as removing a splinter from a foot, he would tell us exactly what he was going to do, give us an estimation of how much it would hurt, and explain the use of any tongs he employed. One Christmas I lurked in corners nursing a twisted splinter in my foot, permitting no one to come near me. When Uncle Jack caught me, he kept me laughing about a preacher who hated going to church so much that every day he stood at his gate in his dressing gown smoking a hookah and delivering 5-minute sermons to any passers-by who desired spiritual comfort. I interrupted to make Uncle Jack let me know when he would pull it out, but he held up a bloody splinter in a pair of tweezers and said he yanked it while I was laughing, and that what was known as relativity. "What's in those packages? None of your business. How's Rose Elmer?" Rose Elmer was Uncle Jack's cat. She was a beautiful yellow female. Uncle Jack said she was one of the few women he could stand permanently. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out some snapshots. We admired them. "Oh, she's getting fat." "Oh, I should think so. She eats all the leftover fingers and ears from the hospital." "Oh, that's a damn story." "I beg your pardon." "Oh, don't pay any attention to her, Jack. She's trying you out. Carl says she's been cussing fluently for a week now." Uncle Jack raised his eyebrows and said nothing. I was proceeding on the dim theory, aside from the innate attractiveness of such words, that if Atticus discovered I had picked them up at school, he wouldn't make me go. But at supper that evening, when I asked him to pass the damn ham, please, Uncle Jack pointed at me. "See me afterwards, young lady." When supper was over, Uncle Jack went to the living room and sat down. He slapped his thighs for me to come sit on his lap. I liked to smell him. He was like a bottle of alcohol and something pleasantly sweet. He pushed back my bangs and looked at me. "You're more like Atticus than your mother. You're also growing out of your pants a little." "Oh, I reckon they fit all right." "Or you like words like damn and hell now, don't you?" "Oh, I said I reckoned so." "Well, I don't. Not unless there's extreme provocation connected with them. I'll be here a week, and I don't want to hear any words like that while I'm here. Scout, you'll get in trouble if you go around saying things like that. You want to grow up to be a lady, don't you?" I said not particularly. "Of course you do. Now, let's get to the tree." We decorated the tree until bedtime, and that night I dreamed of the 2 long packages for Jem and me. Next morning, Jem and I dived for them. They were from Atticus, who had written Uncle Jack to get them for us, and they were what we had asked for. "Don't point them in the house," said Atticus when Jem aimed at a picture on the wall. "You'll have to teach them to shoot," said Uncle Jack. "That's your job," said Atticus. I merely bowed to the inevitable. It took Atticus's courtroom voice to drag us away from the tree. He declined to let us take our air rifles to the landing. I had already begun to think of shooting Francis. and said if we made one false move, he'd take them away from us for good. The guns in the novel become significant later on, so be aware of them. We're going to skip most of this page and go down to 6 lines from the bottom of page 86. When we arrived at the landing, Aunt Alexandra kissed Uncle Jack, Francis kissed Uncle Jack, Uncle Jimmy shook hands silently with Uncle Jack. Jem and I gave our presents to Francis, who gave us a present. Jem felt his age and gravitated to the adults, leaving me to entertain our cousin. Francis was 8 and slicked back his hair. "Well, what did you get for Christmas?" I asked politely. "Well, just what I asked for," he said. Francis had requested a pair of knee pants, a red leather booksack, 5 shirts, and an untied bow tie. "That's nice," I lied. "Jem and me got air rifles, and Jem got a chemistry set. A toy one, I reckon." "No, a real one. He's going to make me some invisible ink, and I'm going to write to Dill in it." And Francis asked, "What's the use of that?" "Well, can't you just see his face when he gets a letter from me with nothing in it? It'll drive him nuts." Talking to Francis gave me the sensation of settling slowly to the bottom of the ocean. He was the most boring child I ever met. As he lived in Mobile, he could not inform on me to school authorities, but he managed to tell everything he knew to Aunt Alexandra, who in turn unburdened herself to Atticus, who either forgot it or gave me hell, whichever struck his fancy. But the only time I ever heard Atticus speak sharply to anyone was when I once heard him say, "Sister, I do the best I can with them." It had something to do with my going around in overalls. Aunt Alexandra was fanatical on the subject of my attire. I could not possibly hope to be a lady if I wore breeches, trousers. When I said I could do nothing in a dress, she said I wasn't supposed to be doing things that required pants. Aunt Alexandra's vision of my deportment involved playing with small stoves, tea sets, and wearing the add-a-pearl necklace she gave me when I was born. Furthermore, I should be a ray of sunshine in my father's lonely life. I suggested that one could be a ray of sunshine in pants just as well, but Auntie said that one had to behave like a sunbeam, that I was born good, but had grown progressively worse every year. She hurt my feelings and set my teeth permanently on edge. But when I asked Atticus about it, he said there were already enough sunbeams in the family, and to go on about my business. He didn't mind me much the way I was. At Christmas dinner, I sat at the little table in the dining room. Jem and Francis sat with the adults at the dining table. Auntie had continued to isolate me long after Jem and Francis graduated to the big table. I often wondered what she thought I'd do. Get up and throw something? I sometimes thought of asking her if she would let me sit at the big table with the rest of them just once. I would prove to her how civilized I could be. After all, I ate at home every day with no major mishaps. And when I begged Atticus to use his influence, he said he had none. We were guests, and we sat where she told us to sit. He also said Aunt Alexandra didn't understand girls much. She'd never had one. But her cooking made up for everything. 3 kinds of meat, summer vegetables from her pantry shelves, peach pickles, 2 kinds of cake, and ambrosia constituted a modest Christmas dinner. Afterwards, the adults made for the living room and sat around in a dazed condition. Jem lay on the floor, and I went to the backyard. "Put on your coat," said Atticus dreamily, so I didn't hear him. Francis sat beside me on the back steps. Oh, that was the best yet. Grandma's a wonderful cook. She's going to teach me how. Boys don't cook. Well, Grandma says all men should learn to cook, that men ought to be careful with their wives and wait on them when they don't feel good. Well, I don't want Dill waiting on me. I'd rather wait on him. Dill? Yeah. Don't say anything about it yet, but we're going to get married as soon as we're big enough. He asked me last summer. Francis hooted. What's the matter with him? Ain't anything the matter with him? You mean that little runt Grandma says stays with Miss Rachel every summer? Well, that's exactly who I mean. I know all about him. What about him? Grandma says he hasn't got a home. Has too. He lives in Meridian. He just gets passed around from relative to relative, and Miss Rachel keeps him every summer. Francis, that's not so. You're mighty dumb sometimes, Jean Louise. I guess you don't know any better, though. What do you mean? Well, if Uncle Atticus lets you run around with stray dogs, that's his own business, like Grandma says, so it ain't your fault. I guess it ain't your fault if Uncle Atticus supports black people. Besides, but I'm here to tell you, it certainly does mortify the rest of the family. Francis, what the hell do you mean? Well, just what I said. Grandma says it's bad enough he lets you all run wild. But now he's turned out an N lover. We'll never be able to walk the streets of Macomb again. He's ruining the family. That's what he's doing. Francis rose and sprinted down the catwalk to the old kitchen. At a safe distance, he called, "He's nothing but an N lover." "He is not," I roared. "I don't know what you're talking about, but you better cut it out this red-hot minute." I leaped off the steps and ran down the catwalk. It was easy to collar Francis. I said, "Take it back quick." Francis jerked loose and sped into the old kitchen. And he keeps on repeating this offensive phrase. When stalking one's prey, it's best to take one's time. Say nothing, and as sure as eggs, he will become curious and emerge. Francis appeared at the kitchen door. "Are you still mad, Jean Louise?" "Well, nothing to speak of." Francis came out on the catwalk. "You're going to take it back, Francis?" But I was too quick on the draw. Francis shot back into the kitchen, so I retired to the steps. I could wait patiently. I had sat there perhaps 5 minutes when I heard Aunt Alexandra speak. "Where's Francis?" "Oh, he's out yonder in the kitchen." "He knows he's not supposed to play in there." Francis came to the door and yelled, "Grandma, she's got me in here and she won't let me out." "What's all this, Jean Louise?" I looked up at Aunt Alexandra. "I haven't got him in there, Auntie. I ain't holding him." "Yes, she is. She won't let me out." "Have you all been fussing?" "Jean Louise got mad at me, Grandma." "Francis, come out of there. Jean Louise, if I hear another word out of you, I'll tell your father." "Did I hear you say hell a while ago?" "No." "I thought I did. I'd better not hear it again." Skip 11 lines. Francis looked at me carefully, concluded that I had been sufficiently subdued, and crooned that awful phrase again. This time I split my knuckle to the bone on his front teeth. My left impaired, I sailed in with my right, but not for long. Uncle Jack pinned my arms to my sides and said, "Stand still." Aunt Alexandra ministered to Francis, wiping his tears away with her handkerchief, rubbing his hair, patting his cheek. Atticus, Jem, and Uncle Jimmy had come to the back porch when Francis started yelling. "Who started this?" said Uncle Jack. Francis and I pointed at each other. "Grandma, she called me a whore lady and jumped on me." "Is that true, Scout?" "I reckon so." "You know I told you you'd get in trouble if you used words like that. I told you, didn't I?" "Yes, sir, but, well, you're in trouble now. Stay there. I was debating whether to stand there or run, and tarried in indecision a moment too long. I turned to flee, but Uncle Jack was quicker. I found myself suddenly looking at a tiny ant struggling with a breadcrumb in the grass. I'll never speak to you again as long as I live. I hate you and I despise you, and I hope you die tomorrow. Well, a statement that seemed to encourage Uncle Jack more than anything. I ran to Atticus for comfort, but he said I had it coming and it was high time we went home. I climbed into the back seat of the car without saying goodbye to anyone, and at home I ran to my room and slammed the door. Jem tried to say something nice, but I wouldn't let him. When I surveyed the damage, there were only 7 or 8 red marks, and I was reflecting upon relativity when someone knocked on the door. I asked who it was. Uncle Jack answered. Go away. Uncle Jack said if I talked like that, he'd lick me again. So I was quiet. When he entered the room, I retreated to a corner and turned my back on him. Scott, do you still hate me? Go on, please, sir. Why, I didn't think you'd hold it against me. I'm disappointed in you. You had that coming, and you know it. Didn't either. Honey, you can't go around calling people. You ain't fair. You ain't fair. Not fair? How not? You're real nice, Uncle Jack, and I reckon I love you even after what you did, but you don't understand children much. And why do I not understand children, Miss Jean Louise? Such conduct as yours required little understanding. It was obstreperous, disorderly, and abusive. You're going to give me a chance to tell you? I don't mean to sass you, I'm just trying to tell you. Proceed. I took a deep breath. Well, in the first place, you never stopped to give me a chance to tell you my side of it. You just lit right into me. When Jem and I fuss, Atticus doesn't ever just listen to Jem's side of it. He hears mine too. And in the second place, you told me never to use words like that except in extreme provocation, and Francis provocated me enough to knock his block off. Well, what was your side of it, Scott? Well, Francis called Atticus something, and I wasn't about to take it off of him. What did Francis call him? An N-lover. I ain't very sure what it means, but the way Francis said it, I tell you one thing right now, Uncle Jack, I swear before God if I'll sit there and let him say something about Atticus. He called Atticus that? Yes, sir, he did, and a lot more. He said Atticus would be the ruination of the family, and he let Jem and me run wild. Well, from the look on Uncle Jack's face, I thought I was in for it again. And when he said, we'll see about this, I knew Francis was in for it. I've a good mind to go out there tonight. Please, sir, just let it go, please. I have no intention of letting it go. Alexandra should know about this. The idea of... Wait until I get my hands on that boy. Uncle Jack, please promise me something, please, sir. Promise you won't tell Atticus about this. He asked me one time not to let anything I heard about him make me mad. And I'd rather him think we were fighting about something else instead. Please promise. But I don't like Francis getting away with something like that. He didn't. You reckon you could tie up my hand? It's still bleeding some. Of course I will, baby. I know of no hand I would be more delighted to tie up. Will you come this way? And Uncle Jack, the doctor, tends Scout's hand. Page 93, 13 lines from the top, about the middle of the page. Later, when I was supposed to be in bed, I went down the hall for a drink of water, and heard Atticus and Uncle Jack in the living room. I shall never marry Atticus. Why? I might have children. You've a lot to learn, Jack. I know. Your daughter gave me my first lesson this afternoon. She said I didn't understand children much and told me why, and she was quite right. Atticus, she told me how I should have treated her. Oh dear, I'm so sorry I romped on her. She earned it, so don't feel too remorseful. I waited on tenterhooks for Uncle Jack to tell Atticus my side of it, but he didn't. Turn to page 94. 15 lines from the top of the page. It's about halfway down. I waited for Uncle Jack to break his promise. He still didn't. Atticus, how bad is this going to be? You haven't had too much chance to discuss it. It couldn't be worse, Jack. The only thing we've got is a black man's word against the Youres. The evidence boils down to you did, I didn't. The jury couldn't possibly be expected to take Tom Robinson's word against the Youres. Are you acquainted with the Youres? Uncle Jack said yes, he remembered them. He described them to Atticus, but Atticus said, "You're a generation off. The present ones are the same, though." What are you going to do then? Before I'm through, I intend to jar the jury a bit. I think we'll have a reasonable chance on appeal, though. I really can't tell at this stage, Jack. You know, I'd hoped to get through life without a case of this kind. But John Taylor pointed at me and said, "You're it." Let this cup pass from you, eh? Right. But do you think I could face my children otherwise? You know what's going to happen as well as I do, Jack. And I hope and pray I can get Jem and Scout through it without bitterness, and most of all, without catching Macomb's usual disease. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad when anything involving a black man comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. I just hope that Jem and Scout come to me for their answers instead of listening to the town. I hope they trust me enough. Jean Louise? Sir? Go to bed. I scurried to my room and went to bed. Uncle Jack was a prince of a fellow not to let me down. But I never figured out how Atticus knew I was listening. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word he said. Atticus refers to Macomb's usual disease, and that, of course, is the disease of racism. You need to start writing notes on the theme of racism. We start to see the ripples of this theme in this chapter as people start to respond to Atticus's defense of a black man, Tom Robinson. Scout battles with growing up. She is our narrator, and we see how she really has to face more challenging issues and attitudes from this chapter. Please take note of the key quote when Atticus tells her that she must try fighting with her head for a change. Gender issues are an important theme. Aunt Alexandra has a very definite idea of how a girl should act, dress, and speak, and it obviously contrasts with the way Scout dresses and the way that she acts. She is, however, going to have to face her female identity as the novel progresses, as she grows up. In this chapter, we have a better idea of Atticus's parenting style. He leads by example. He is honest with his children and he talks to them as adults. He doesn't try to shelter them from the harsh realities of the world, and he tries to teach them how to deal with such challenges. My grade 10s, you need to finish this worksheet. When you have, email me and I'll send you the model answers. And that's the end of another chapter of this wonderful novel. Until next time, goodbye.